that's left us years ago. So there ain't no fate except the one you make, and there ain't no hell except the shit you take.
In a surprising twist, I was invited to give a presentation for the All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church during their seasonal series about the spiritual odysseys of a varied selection of individuals. I was surprised to be introduced to them by my local skeptics group, who are all atheists. So what are they doing in this church, I asked myself. This one in particular welcomes anyone of any religious affiliation, or none at all, as half the congregation identifies itself as humanist, the nice way of saying atheist. Deconversion stories in the atheist community seem almost a prerequisite on YouTube, but I was lucky enough to be invited to give mine on a podium in front of a live audience.
Okay, let's get started. To understand where I come from, it's necessary to explore events that began long before I was born. October 9th, 1933, a 15-minute broadcast can be heard by an organization called the Radio Church of God. The originator of the broadcast is an evangelist named Herbert W. Armstrong, as you can see here, whose ministry over the course of 5 decades had profound implications for my family and upbringing. The Old Testament-centered theology begun by Armstrong is unconventional enough that it's necessary to explain in brief detail for anyone to gain an appreciation of my background. This religious belief is variously known as Armstrongism and might, in some circles, be referred to as Hebrew roots Christianity. So Armstrong founded the Worldwide Church of God as an outgrowth of the Radio Church of God, and this fringe movement asks a number of poignant questions to other Christians. What do painted eggs and chocolate bunny rabbits have to do with the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ? And did you know Jesus wasn't really born on December 25th? It turns out that a lot of Christians don't really understand the phylogeny of their own faith, but I felt very privileged that I was one of the lucky ones. This is the belief system that attracted my parents when they met on the campus of Ambassador College in Big Sandy, Texas. Unlike most children of the 60s, fringe Christianity was my parents' drug of choice. Armstrong and his teachings became the primary sculptor of their entire lives and those of many others. But before I go any further, let me add that my parents certainly mean well, and they really did take good care of me, and that makes it all much more complicated. So growing up, they taught me the doctrines of Herbert W. Armstrong and the accusations made by his sect, which reach back into the historical underpinnings of Christianity, specifically the claim that so much of Christianity has been corrupted. Personally, the last time I was in this building, Barbara Griggs was giving a presentation on neo-paganism, a topic of historical relevance for me in my upbringing, because it turns out if you learn enough about neo-paganism, you end up learning about Christianity by default. And some of her details were familiar to me, specifically the references of rabbits as fertility symbols, because I came to similar knowledge from the other direction. The sect, described as Armstrongism, touches upon these roots of Christian theology as a justification to reject nearly all of the traditional Christian holidays and go all the way back to the Old Testament. So I'm a black kid growing up in Missouri, never eating pork or shellfish, and I'm going to church on Saturday. How crazy is that? But when I was younger, I was confident because, of course, I was born into the right church. Of course. How fortunate. Isn't it interesting that if you study religious distributions by geography, you'll find that the majority of people, anywhere you go, always feel fortunate that they were born into the right religion. But I never used to think about that when I was younger. Within what I've come to call my childhood or hereditary church, there are 3 central pillars of belief that shaped my upbringing, and the first is represented by this Old Testament revivalism. So my family, not only are we going to church on Saturday, occasionally I'll have to bring in notes to school explaining how I'm going to be out of class for events such as the Feast of Tabernacles, as well as the Feast of Trumpets, otherwise known as Rosh Hashanah to the Jews, even though we're not Jewish, in case you couldn't tell. Not to mention the Day of Atonement or Yom Kippur. And of course, we kept Passover. But all these festivals derived from the Old Testament were subjected to a sort of Christian mutagen, where the Gospels were blended with Jewish rituals into a bizarre modernist syncretism. And of course, there were the dietary laws, which in my youth allowed me to feel smugly superior, which I think is pretty much the point of all dietary restriction laws, to make some people feel artificially superior to other people. As far as I can tell, that's the only purpose they serve. But these observances stand and fall on their own, and they seem arbitrary today, but they could be justified simply because it's possible to tangentially derive them from reading the Bible and just not rejecting all of Leviticus. But the second pillar of my childhood church was an item that really was subject to a more critical examination, and that was always my problem. It was never good enough to just believe something simply because someone wrote it down thousands of years ago. I had to be convinced that some sort of evidence existed, even if, on balance, it wasn't really very good evidence. For most people, trying to find that evidence becomes the death knell for many theistic beliefs. So I began to have a few problems with the second article of faith, namely, that the second coming of Jesus is imminent, and that we have to ready ourselves for the destruction of civilization as the elements burn with a fervent heat. It was always just around the corner. In the Worldwide Church of God, founded by Armstrong, this expectation was constant. As my dad put it, the future looked like a train schedule. Confident predictions that God would not let this wicked age persist much longer. But the wicked age persisted and persisted and kept on persisting. Still it persisted, and so the first crack in my theological armor occurred before I was even born. In the Worldwide Church of God, it became another article of faith that the world was supposed to be destroyed in 1975, before I was even born. At this time, the beast power from Revelations would unite everyone who'd gotten the mark of the beast, varying interpretations of what the mark of the beast is, whereupon, after getting the mark of the beast, the armies of the beast power from Revelations were supposed to attack Jerusalem only to be defeated by Jesus returning in his glory. And of course, there is a lot of good research on the sort of psychological defense mechanisms that occur when explicit religious prophecies explicitly fail. So my parents and our splinter group employed these mechanisms as they fissioned off from the infighting corpse of the declining Worldwide Church of God. They adapted to this failure with thief in the night verses, which explained how no man knew the hour of the Lord's coming. It was only much later that I came to understand that most of those reassurances in the New Testament were themselves written to believers losing faith in the apocalypse, which they expected 2,000 years ago. And so the verses that my parents and church used to keep us enthusiastic about the world being destroyed were also used 2,000 years ago to calm the fears of other Christians who were expecting Jesus to come back and destroy the world then. But I didn't realize that at the time, not until many years later. So believers were losing faith in the apocalypse and the heavenly glory supposedly to follow, both then and now bolstered by the same verses. But the cracks in my belief were worsened by apocalyptic scenarios and attempted apologetics. So, just prior to the year 2000, the European continent was in the process of setting the groundwork for the European Union and a common currency. Now, my parents and many other ministers in our particular splinter group painted a terrifying proposition. This was a big deal. I was conditioned into accepting this other, more bizarre prophecy. See, the countries in Europe forming the European Union were the alleged fulfillment of a prophecy in Daniel 11:9, where a king of the north will invade a king of the south. Supposedly, Europe was scheduled to unite under the Antichrist, forcing everyone to get the mark of the beast, and somehow they were going to form a colossal army that would destroy America. This was a big deal. And this was drilled into us sermon after sermon after sermon. But this was never explained to me in any tactical sense how such a thing was going to happen. But then the colossal army of the beast was going to invade the Holy Land, where the Antichrist would commit the abomination of desolations in the soon-to-be constructed new Jewish temple. Jesus, of course, would descend in a chariot of fire to avenge this grievance at the end of days. So as a child, I was conditioned into accepting these ideas without thinking much about it, but upon meeting anyone from Europe, as I did when I reached college, the notion of a Satan-worshipping army under the rule of religious fascism rapidly becomes too embarrassingly absurd to mention. I was in college, and I met this guy from Germany, and I tried to be friends with him. And he was a really smart guy. He spoke 5 languages. And, we talked a little bit about American culture and American education. And there was just never a right time to bring it up. And just talking to him for 5 seconds just kind of deflated that whole concept. Yeah. So how any of it was supposed to work militarily, that never really had an adequate explanation. But the belief persisted because America deserves to be destroyed by an evil army. We deserve to be destroyed by this army of evil because we don't pray in school enough, we elect the wrong people to public office, and we're too nice to homosexuals. That's just the only way to put it. And so my parents longed for the good old days, but I realized some years ago that the good old days never really existed, and being wistful about America's more religious past is to gloss over slavery and Jim Crow, and it becomes a classic case of be careful what you wish for in case you were to get it. But because of these moral factors, God will find some way to destroy America as punishment. The details were unimportant. I really, really thought hard about this. I was really thinking about it, like how gay marriage is supposed to destroy the family and undermine the country. I really thought about it, but I just kept coming up empty. I couldn't find a tangible reason how anyone was really going to be hurt by it. I tried, but I just couldn't come up with anything. And I never figured out exactly how and why society should disintegrate as a result of gay marriage. But then the Christian trump card, of course, is, well, we have to oppose gay marriage because if it happens, God will be angry and will send us tornadoes, more tornadoes. So the ultimate rebuttal is a meteorological one because God is going to send us more tornadoes in his anger if we allow gay marriage, which actually would be a testable concept, but nobody seemed interested in testing it. But, if you're going to let your thinking go down that rabbit hole, you might as well go back to the Bronze Age and live in a thatched roofed hut. So there I was in college, having a hard time believing in the apocalypse, but much more salient about the third pillar of my religious upbringing, creationist pseudoscience. And that was the point for which my religious indoctrination was the strongest. The third pillar of Armstrongism is to enshrine ignorance of science through a determined misunderstanding of evolution. It's really essential to the faith. But of course, there were other important aspects too of the faith. And like many other children with a strong religious upbringing, I learned all the traditional Bible stories. I was steeped in the classic verses that everyone in Sunday school learns, except we didn't go to church on Sunday, remember? I went to Sabbath school. I would learn John 3:16, of course, and I really do know the 10 Commandments. Some Christians don't. I really do know them. And some of the weirder commandments, like the one about not boiling lambs in their mother's milk, and also the one about not mixing 2 kinds of fabrics together. But everyone seemed to ignore that. No one really took that very seriously. But they kept the dietary laws, but ignored the laws about not mingling fabrics together. So everyone pretty much has to cherry pick. Even after all these years, I can still recite every book in the Old Testament, the names of every book in the Old Testament, by memory in sequential order, for all the good that does me. But as a sidebar to these lessons, we would receive special printed inserts from the Home Office for our Armstrongist splinter group that would have a lesson in biology. In these pamphlets, I would learn stilted, simplistic arguments about why such creatures as whales, lichen, and migratory birds such as the golden plover just couldn't evolve through the mischaracterization of outdated quotes from scientists. I was assured that evolution of all these creatures was impossible, and by extension, humans can't evolve either. And this was the belief that justified everything. In the minds of many religious believers, if you can convince yourself that evolution is impossible, then the only alternative most people can come up with is some kind of God. So that removes a stumbling block to asserting that, well, it must be your God. If you believe or convince yourself evolution can happen, then it's easier to believe that, well, your God must be real. Except that not only Christians use this argument, Muslims use the argument too, and maybe a few Hindus. So it could apply potentially to any God in any religion, but the people who believe it, they always want to apply it to their particular God for some reason. Okay, so Mark of the Beast, yeah. So even when I had difficulty believing in a neo-fascistic European empire who would establish the Mark of the Beast under the Antichrist, for a long time, creationism still seemed plausible. And that was problematic when I got to college because, of course, I wanted to study biology. Of course. Yeah. F. Scott Fitzgerald once said that the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. And I was accidentally, on purpose, inadvertently trying to exemplify that observation. It was a confused and confusing time. But I was well prepared because I spent my teen years devouring all manner of creationist publications. I was strongly encouraged by my parents in the hopes that I would get the real scoop on the evidence for creation, which supposedly every biologist is hiding as part of a deliberate conspiracy to undermine faith in Jesus. So biology is a conspiracy. I guess by extension, geology is also a conspiracy, and maybe physics is a conspiracy too. Probably chemistry would be a conspiracy. But that wasn't explicit. It was mainly biology and biologists who, they must be evil liars. They must be, somehow. So, there was so much to learn, though, and so many problems. And my childhood indoctrination put me on the cognitively dissonant path of wanting to learn about biology, but at the same time, almost not wanting to learn too much biology because there was this lingering fear that there might be something I couldn't explain through my religious upbringing. But in the end, I just kept learning, and I learned so much that actually I was able to give creationist speeches myself, and they actually were compelling to people who believed that Europe was going to become a neo-fascistic army under the Antichrist. That crowd actually found it compelling. So yeah, I was actually able to give creationist speeches many years ago. But for every creationist who is actually serious about learning biology, there comes a tipping point where you can continue to be a creationist or you can be honest. But nevertheless, despite the stumbling blocks I put in my own way, I managed to squeak out a degree in molecular biology. But even then, my resolve was kind of weakening. I actually attended a conference for microbiologists at the behest of one of my professors, and at no time did anyone confess to the evil conspiracy which I was promised existed. And I began to slowly discover that the proofs of creation, they just kind of kept getting weaker, and there were always rational alternatives and rational explanations, and there were some downright frauds. But ironically, the fatal cracks in the dam came not from science, but really from history. If a proposition such as creationism is true, then from this you can derive certain logical conclusions about the world. And my notions of a personal God became increasingly difficult to maintain as time passed. God loves us more than we love ourselves, and supposedly knows each hair on every one of our heads. But this, of course, brings to mind the problem of evil, sometimes referred to as theodicy. Well, obviously, Jesus is the answer. If only I would let Jesus into my heart, then I would change and become like him. and be able to handle anything that comes. And the world would be perfect if only everyone else would do the same. If only. But that raised other questions as I got older. So did medieval Christians have Jesus in their hearts when they exterminated the Cathars and various other heretic sects? Or during the witch burnings of the Inquisition, was Jesus in their hearts then? I continued reading and studying on my own during and after college, well on the way to studying myself out of Christianity. And then there are all the religious wars, like the 30 Years' War. I read some estimates that maybe 7 million people died in Germany, maybe 3 times that if you try to calculate the rest of the continent, over 30 years over the question of which ethnic group had the right to be which religion while under the rule of which petty potentate, and then you can't avoid wondering, if God is omnipotent, why can't he settle it if he loves us so much? But it's a mystery. And the more I learned about these problems, the more the problems seem to deepen. Christians universally maintain that they have a relationship with Jesus and that he lives in their hearts. So if Jesus is living in their hearts, why can't he reliably communicate consistent answers on the most important issues of the day? Like our own American Civil War. Both sides of the American Civil War were deeply devout Christians, probably over 90% easily, each totally convinced that God favored their side. Why did it take 628,000 casualties to settle the issue through brute force? Why couldn't Jesus communicate his will to all who believed in him? Do I deserve to be locked into chattel slavery for the color of my skin or not?
So I don't expect you all to understand.